A recent state law reclassified an estimated 1 million California workers, including those who work in the state's booming gig economy, as company employees rather than independent contractors. What will it mean for workers, the companies that employ them, and those who buy their products or use their services? We'll ask Sophia Bollag with the Sacramento Bee, Allan Zaremberg with the California Chamber of Commerce, Steve Smith with the California Federation of Labor, and we'll get political analysis from Dan Walters of CalMatters and John Myers with the Los Angeles Times.
BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. While there are a few areas of bipartisan agreement at the State Capitol, there is around a new state law, AB 5. Both sides agree that there is potential for this law to fundamentally alter the new gig economy. The disagreement is on whether it's going to change it for the better or for the worse. Our guest is Sophia Bollag, who's a reporter who covers the State Capitol for the Sacramento Bee. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
So, AB 5 basically attempted to codify last year's California Supreme Court decision in Dynamex. What happened in that decision and what did the court rule?
Yeah, so basically Dynamex is a delivery company that at some point converted their drivers from employees to independent contractors, and subsequently the drivers sued. And ultimately, the California Supreme Court sided with them. Basically, they were arguing that they were doing essentially the same job that they had been doing when they were employees, but they weren't getting those employee benefits. Those can range from, minimum wage guarantees to overtime pay.
Employment compensation, workers' compensation, all that kind of
stuff.
Exactly,
yeah. So the Supreme Court ultimately sided with the workers against Dynamex, and in that ruling, they set out a new test to determine basically which workers should be classified as employees and which should be classified as contractors. So that's what AB 5...
It was called the ABC test, and I think
yes.
that the test focuses on whether the work, there's a number of things they look at, but the main thing is whether the work performed was outside the core of the company's business. That was the key issue.
Exactly, yeah. And that's really probably going to be the biggest change that we're going to see as this moves forward.
And so you were saying that the reason why the company did this is they wanted to save money. So you changed them from employees to, from independent contractors to employees to save on things like they don't have to pay attention to minimum wage or overtime laws or unemployment all those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, I think it's actually the other way, like switching from an employee to an independent contractor.
Right. So they don't have to pay all those things. It's a savings way to save money, and this is not a new thing. Companies have done this in the past. So there were some negotiations by Uber and Lyft offering some kind of compromise proposal because they saw this thing coming down the tracks, as it were. What were they offering it, and why were they offering it?
Basically, Uber and Lyft were suggesting a kind of compromise. You could maybe characterize it like that, or sort of a third possibility.
A different, kind of a new approach, not quite collective bargaining. They have an employee association, but not quite the same thing.
So there would be some collective bargaining as part of what Uber and Lyft have been proposing. It would also basically guarantee some minimum employee benefits, like a minimum wage guarantee, a fund that they would pay into that would fund things like parental leave, that type of thing. And it would also have some sort of collective bargaining as well.
Not like the traditional type. It'd be different.
Called sectoral bargaining. We don't have a ton of details about what they exactly how that would look.
Well, let me ask you this. So what about, it's not just the gig economy, right? There's lots of other jobs that could be affected as well, traditional jobs. So there's been this stampede of various industries seeking exemptions. What kinds of jobs are being exempted and why?
Yeah, so there are dozens of industries that have been exempted, ranging from lawyers to doctors to real estate agents, hairdressers.
There's a whole laundry list.
Yes, it's a very long list. And basically, the author of the bill, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, has said that she worked on choosing which professions to exempt from this new employment test, based on how much autonomy those workers have in their day-to-day jobs, how much negotiating power they have over wages and how much they ultimately end up getting paid.
Now, it's going to be interesting how to see how that go forward. So let me ask you, so this is not the end of this, I'm sure.
No.
What's the future here? Are more lawsuits, propositions likely to follow?
Yes. So Uber, Lyft, and another so-called gig economy company called DoorDash have actually pledged that if they, don't reach some sort of compromise or deal with lawmakers and organized labor, that would give them some flexibility from, having to classify their workers as employees, that they would launch a ballot measure campaign, take the issue right to voters, and they've already pledged a combined $90 million, which even in the world of California ballot measures is a lot of money.
Yeah,
so,
that's significant money.
Yeah, and then there's also likely going to be litigation that's allowed for under the law and the law that will take effect January 1st. And Uber has already said that it is not planning to reclassify its drivers as employees. So
we're going to see some lawsuits.
Likely so, yeah.
I want to thank Sophia Bollag with the Sacramento Bee for joining us. Up next, what do business groups think? We'll ask the President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce, Allan Zaremberg. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our guest is Allan Zaremberg, the President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here, always.
AB 5, big issue. What are some of the business community's biggest concerns about AB 5?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty. Let's around AB 5, and let's step back a second, because I think it's really important to put it in perspective. AB 5 is a response to a California Supreme Court case that dealt with an out-of-state company that did deliveries in California. Very narrow facts, very narrow law behind it, because the law really hasn't been updated in many, many years. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very limited opinion, but that applied to a very limited set of circumstances. But the legislature took that and said, we're going to apply the court ruling to everybody, and with some exemptions. And I think that's the question is, what is the standard that you have? Can I continue to do business the same way? And I think you have to look at it from a business perspective from both sides.
Yeah.
The business that uses an independent contractor and the independent contractor. That's where the uncertainty
arises. And one of the big issues, I took an Uber over here to the studio, and I was talking to the driver, and not surprisingly, he said flexibility is the biggest thing that we really like as drivers. So, that's been an argument about why Uber drivers or those people in the gig economy shouldn't be employees. They should still be independent contractors. But don't those situations, that flexibility exist already in retail and fast food with employees?
Okay, so let's step back here a second, because I think it's really important to put this in context. All the publicity, all the press has been around Uber and Lyft and the drivers and those ride-sharing apps. Okay, there's a lot of people in California that rely on independent contractors, doctors in rural hospitals, nurses in rural hospitals, nurses in clinics that work different clinics. Are they independent contractors? Are they employees? That's the question, because it leads to litigation, it leads to back pay, it leads to overtime. Those are the things that everybody loses sight of.
There are a lot of traditional industries that are being affected.
Yes, there are and so to that point, and so if we go on to, we talked about ride-sharing programs, that deal with apps, that connect the purchaser with the driver. Right. The Supreme Court case dealt with facts in 2004. The iPhone wasn't even introduced into our economy by then. So for the legislature to take a law and say a court case and say narrow facts, we're going to apply it to everybody, that's why it doesn't work. And that's why there's a lot of exemptions in the law and more that need to come.
Yeah, so let me ask you a little about the gig economy. Some people say this is an existential threat to the gig economy. Others say that this is just getting gig companies to factor in the real cost of doing business like any other company and business model, which is right.
Well, it is a different economy, but you have to look at it once again from both the rider, who is maybe concerned about making sure that they have affordable rides and an on-time ride, and they can rate the driver, and the driver and the company, do they have the freedom? So to say that you can pick your own schedule, if you're an employee at a restaurant, you don't pick your own schedule. If you're an employee at a retailer, you don't pick your own schedule. That that is a bogus argument that, oh, these people will be the same whether or not they're independent contractors or employees. That's not true. You know,
Well,
somebody
the other
who's-
argument is that these companies are smart enough to figure out a way to make this happen, have flexibility and be an employee.
Well, I think they may have some resources, but it certainly is a barrier to entry for other companies, you know, to be able to say that. And I would say that, you know, they'll have to decide, you know, how do they set this up? And so the question is, what do you sacrifice? You know, affordability, flexibility on the driver's part, you know, people who work on their own. That's what the consumer cares about.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think this is going to create a national trend? Other states are going to follow California this way? Or do you think the federal government's going to step in and support the kind of this app for hire gig worker business model?
Well, I think the federal government, as it's structured today, is quite clear that people who fall into this category are independent contractors. You know, and so the law sets up, the new statute, AB 5, sets up two different tests. One is an old court case and one is a new court case to determine whether or not you're an employee. But the federal government said these people are independent contractors. They've already opined on that, and it may change with the next administration, but for them, they're independent contractors.
Well, we were talking earlier about the non-traditional companies that are going to be impacted by this. You know, in the end, it may mean more money for these workers, but it's also going to mean higher costs for the companies. So the question is, what overall impact is this going to have on the California economy?
Well, I think there's a question of whether or not, you know, how much money do you make as a worker when you pick your own hours, you decide when you want to work, when you want to go to school, when you want to pick up your kids. You know, you can't put a price tag on that. So when you say, is it more money for them? Maybe, maybe not. So I'm not sure that's the case. The question is, for the rider, do they have a ride on time? You know, do they have somebody who's there and they can rely on, is dependable, and that they can afford?
Yeah, very good. Well, I want to thank Allan Zaremberg from the California Chamber of Commerce for joining us. Up next, what do labor groups think? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. George Skelton, the columnist for the LA Times, has referred to AB 5 as, quote, organized labor's biggest legislative victory in years, unquote. Does labor agree? Our guest is Steve Smith, Director of Communications for the California Federation of Labor. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Great to be here.
So the business community has argued that this whole reclassification of workers from independent contractors to employees really misses the point. The real point is freedom and flexibility that these arrangements allow. And besides, this is a second job and just for a little extra money. How do you respond to that?
A couple of points here. One, there's nothing in AB 5 that prevents companies like Uber and Lyft from providing maximum flexibility. Absolutely nothing in the law that would prevent them from continuing to provide the same flexibility they do today. In fact, we think that the business model is such that they would need to provide that flexibility in order to stay in business. The problem here is not that flexibility would be lost, it's that Uber and Lyft simply don't want to pay for basic protections, things like workers' comp if workers are injured on the job, unemployment insurance if they're laid off, even a minimum wage. They don't want to pay for these basic protections, so they're using red herrings like flexibility in order to scare folks.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually took an Uber on the way over here, and I asked the driver, I said, what do you care most about? He said flexibility.
Yeah.
So that's a big issue for some of the drivers. You know, the Wall Street Journal editorial board has stated, quote, reclassifying gig workers as employees would erode the flexibility and economics of digital platforms. So what do you say to those who argue that applying out-of-date labor laws to the modern workplace and the realities of the modern economy just doesn't make sense?
Well, we agree that labor laws were out of date. That's why the Supreme Court ruled the way that it did in the Dynamex case, because we have this whole new business model that was created by the gig economy that essentially was created around the idea of misclassifying workers as independent contractors when they're actually doing everything an employee does. So we agree the laws needed to be updated. That's precisely what the court did in a unanimous decision, and then that was then taken and codified into labor code here in California with AB 5. We think, look, Uber and Lyft say they're the most innovative companies on the planet. If they're so innovative, there's certainly a way to figure out how to provide the basic protections that all other companies have to provide in California while maintaining the flexibility that workers want.
Yeah, I think the point of flexibility that workers want, I mean, the reality is I would think that's how they attract those drivers. And they need to figure that out to, in other words, maintain that flexibility, or they're going to lose their workforce.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And again, these are so-called innovators. There is nothing in AB 5 that prevents them from providing flexibility. We feel they can do that. We feel they should do that.
Well, there's a flip side. There's another argument that says that, hey, listen, this is going to put California at a competitive disadvantage with other states, and therefore it's going to hurt the state economy.
Yeah, look, since 2010, California has created 3.13 million jobs. During that time, we have raised minimum wage to $15 an hour. We have provided paid sick days to every worker. We've expanded paid family leave. We are now working toward giving every worker in the state of California more of an opportunity to stand together in a union, to bargain with their boss over wages and other benefits. We have the most pro-worker laws in the country here in California, and we have also managed to be the nation's leader in job creation. That tells us that these two things are not in conflict.
Okay, let me hit you with a tough one.
Yeah.
Okay, there are some people that say that, listen, this is all just a money grab by unions. They simply want to find a new pool of potentially dues-paying members.
No, listen, the organizing that has happened with drivers across the state has come from the grassroots level. These are driver-led movements because for so long they've been cheated. They've been seen their pay rates continue to go down. They've seen their costs continue to go up. There's a driver who was profiled in the San Francisco Chronicle working 60 hours a week, and he lives in his car because he can't afford a place to live. This is not the American dream that we grew up with. Uber and Lyft have been cheating, exploiting their workers for far too long, and drivers are the ones saying, we're going to band together and do something
Well,
about
let me
it.
ask you this. When companies see labor costs go up, they automate. I mean, you see the self-checkouts at grocery stores. Are you concerned at all that Uber and Lyft are going to say, you know what, we'll just accelerate the move toward self-driving cars?
Uber and Lyft are doing everything they possibly can to move toward self-driving cars right now. There's nothing more they could do to accelerate. The problem with self-driving cars is they're not safe. They're not safe for riders. They're not safe for pedestrians. They're not safe for other drivers. Now, maybe someday, eventually, that will change and the technology will create a safer self-driving car, but we don't see that happening anytime soon. There is nothing about this law or labor costs or anything else that's going to affect Uber's position on self-driving cars. They're already trying to move much more quickly than they should toward that. What this does do is provide workers with some economic security that they so lack in this economy. That's a good thing.
Okay, well, I want to thank Steve Smith from the California Federation of Labor for joining us. Up next, what are the political implications of AB 5? A conversation with Walters and Myers in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. Perhaps the biggest issue debated at the state capitol was around something we can all relate to. What does it mean to be an employee? We're joined by Dan Walters of CalMatters and John Myers of the LA Times. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So John, is this issue a response to the widening income gap between those who have and those who don't?
Some, I think broadly speaking, it's a response to the changing nature of work in the 21st century. I think as we have seen some industries flourish that use independent contractors, whether it's ride sharing or trucking or other industries, there have been these pushbacks that there aren't enough protections of those people in those jobs. They don't have enough benefits. And when they don't have benefits, the argument is they come back to the government system to use benefits there. And so I think it's balled all together in there. And what we ended up with, I think, was a victory for one side, organized labor, but I don't think the conversation ends there.
Yeah, let me ask you that, Dan, about organized labor. I mean, what does this mean for their political clout, for unions?
Well, it shows they have political clout in the current legislature. It also implies something else about organizing. They've been losing members in California. Their membership's been declining steadily for the last...
On a percentage basis?
No, in absolute numbers.
Absolute terms as well.
Absolute numbers. And they've probably maxed out on public employees. They're looking to organize private sector employees, and they need more private sector employees if they're going to be able to organize.
Well, you know,
them.
California lost all the manufacturing in Southern California, so that was a big hit for them.
There've been a number, and they've never been able to crack Silicon Valley. And so they're looking for opportunities, and this may be an opportunity. I also pointed out that the background of this thing is unusual. It was a Supreme Court decision that set this whole thing in motion. A company down in San Diego, a delivery company, had employed drivers and then changed them from employees over to contractors, opening the door then for a lawsuit that ultimately resulted in this ABC test that the legislature now puts in law, except that it's offered some exceptions,
Right.
and there's going to be other people pushing for more exceptions, and
Right.
and there's also going to be probably a ballot fight over the whole thing. So we've not seen the last of this at all.
What about union political power as a result of this?
I certainly think they come out ahead. I mean, they had a big win. It's not, I don't think you could say that organized labor has lost any of its real political muscle in Sacramento, even with a lot of changes from sizes to rules about their political money. I think the question is, what do they do with it now? Is it about organization, or is it about these other issues they care about, including wages, minimum wages, benefits? There are a lot of places here that I think organized labor may seek to use this victory on AB 5 to move an agenda forward.
It seemed like labor kind of took it on the chin with Janet's decision by the Supreme Court for public sector workers, and now
Hasn't had much impact, at least in terms of muscle right now.
Yeah, but they were very concerned about that
Right.
Initially. So, John, what about the impact on the governor's Future of Work Commission? He's got this commission out there. What impact is this going to have?
I don't know. I don't want to be a skeptic, but if I was going to be a skeptic, I mean, you know, blue ribbon commissions are a dime a dozen, right? I mean, but there are a lot of people on this, and I think it does tee up an issue nicely, which I said at the top of this conversation, which is what is the nature of work in the 21st century, how work is changing, how we use it, automation issues, benefits and rights. I think it's a good conversation. I don't know what the end product of that commission is going to be or when, but it certainly gives them something to start off with.
And you also have to remember that California is not an island, although we act like it sometimes. So whatever happens here on work rules and gig economy and everything will reverberate in other places. And California can't make itself so uncompetitive with these other places that we start facing the economic consequences.
You know, it's interesting. You remind me of law school. You know, we used to study with majority of rule, what the majority of states are doing, what the minority of states are doing. I went to University of Wisconsin, and then we studied, what's California doing? So this is, you know, I won't say how many, long time ago. So it's been that way for a while.
Yeah, there's actually a similar push on gig workers going on in New York right now.
Right. So there you go. So what about the presidential election, John? What do you think this issue is going to resonate in the presidential election?
I think it's already started to trickle into that conversation. You had a handful of Democratic presidential candidates who backed AB 5. I think the first one was Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, with an op-ed in a newspaper. I think you're going to hear that conversation. I think it plays into that larger national narrative, again, about the workplace and workplace rights. And then to Dan's point earlier, this is not over, because 3 of the companies that lost out here, Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, the gig sharing economy, have put $90 million into a ballot measure campaign that they say they will try to take this to the voters next year to get their own rights and their own exclusion here. We'll see what they do and how they do it, but they have put up the money.
Yeah.
There might be 2 ballot measures, one to negate the law, a referendum, and another one to put an alternative law on the books so that the Supreme Court is blocked out from doing it again. Yeah. So if they just negate the law, the Supreme Court decision stands. So it doesn't really accomplish it. They have to get an alternative law in the books. So we may have 2 ballot measures, not just one.
I want to thank our guests, John Myers of the LA Times, Dan Walters of CalMatters, Sophia Bollag with the Sacramento Bee, Allan Zaremberg with the California Chamber of Commerce, and Steve Smith with the California Federation of Labor. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.